From vaudeville to the silver screen to the small screen, the Marx Brothers made an impact wherever people found them. Now, Tom Fox and Mike Volkov bring them into the boardroom to help explain and explore the sometimes chaotic world of governance, risk management, ethics, and compliance. This is Why a Duck? Into the Compliance Soup, which is part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist and the voice of compliance, along with Mike Volkov, and we are back for another episode of Why a Duck. First of all, Mike, I realize we've got to get you a cool nickname, so you need to think about that. But we are both back to discuss our joint love of the Marx Brothers and of compliance. So, Mike, today we're going to start two episodes where we talk about Horsefeathers, which I think is one of the funniest movies I have ever seen. I can still remember the first time I saw it when I was 17. I went to a college follies night and watched it. And the next day I was telling my father about it, and he recited some of the scenes from memory. It made such an impact on him. So for that incredibly long-winded introduction, welcome.
Well, thanks. Maybe I should take on a Harpo Marx name of, Pinky, Stuffy, whatever. Just to bring my own perspective, I used to go, if you're from the Washington, D.C. area, there used to be a movie theater downtown called the Biograph, which in Georgetown used to show old films. And they would have triple features of the Marx Brothers. And I would go with a friend of mine, and we would spend the whole day just laughing and enjoying I still remember it. I was 13 or 12 then, and it was an incredible love affair that started right then and there. So Horsefeathers is also an incredible movie, just because there's so many good scenes, which I know we're going to talk about probably in the next episode, but it revolves around Groucho Marx as Professor Quincy Adams Wagstaff. And it revolves around a college football game between two colleges, Darwin and Huxley colleges. And Wagstaff is the new president of Huxley College. His son goes there, who is Zeppo, who, by the way, apparently in the Vaudeville days was the funniest Marx brother. But never really got his due in any of the movies. He was always a straight man for his brother Groucho. But in any event, the Chico and Harpo, who are Baravelli and Pinky, end up being mistaken as two star football players that have to be, and ultimately Harpo and Chico are ultimately kidnapped by the real two star players and made fun of. And then the climax of the whole film is the game itself between Darwin and Huxley College. And there are just so many funny scenes in it. But it really is a great movie. There's so many great scenes. And there's also Thelma Todd was in it, who was Connie Bailey and was a great character, foil for Groucho Marx.
Football game, the football scenes in there was so good. They had the hidden ball trick. They had some really interesting signal calling, and even ESPN recognized it as one of the top 11 scenes in football movie history. And the end of it, and I will just spoiler alert, we're going to talk about the end where Pinky, of course, scores the winning touchdown. He rides a chariot across the goal line, and it was one of the funniest things I think a trash can.
In a trash can. It was a trash can converted into a chariot. Just hilarious.
And it was just hilarious. I can still remember laughing so hard I cried. But some of the great scenes in this movie we're going to talk about in our next episode. But in this episode, we wanted to take on the division, as Mike so lovingly calls it, the Antitrust Division's evaluation of compliance programs document that they released in July. This was certainly something new. So, Mike, you want to set the stage about what you think led to this and what it really means from the antitrust enforcement perspective?
Yeah, this is it is a very important document, and I'm not just saying it like we say about everything, because it was sort of a long path for the Antitrust Division to get there. Because the Antitrust Division since the 90s has been using the leniency program, under which the first reporter from a cartel that reports to the government, and they will get immunity along with any officers or directors or employees who were involved who cooperate. And it has been the engine of many, many massive cartel cases in the 90s, leading to it also involved Archer Daniels and the famous movie The Informant with Matt Damon. But nonetheless, they've had a great history, a great success with the leniency program. And one of the things that the Antitrust Division has just historically resisted was the idea that people should get any more benefit for a compliance program and maintaining an effective compliance program. Their logic used to be that since cartels require senior manager at least involvement, sometimes all the way up to senior executives or CEOs, that they should be disqualified from receiving that. Well, through the years, their resistance has been worn down, and I think this culmination in the guidance basically is the end of that, where they're sort of now in conformance to the extent they can be with other parts of the criminal division, other parts of the government, in terms of rewarding companies for implementing effective ethics and compliance. The big issue now is it has no impact on the first company that reports, but now the second company that reports, or even the third, if they have an effective compliance program in place at the time the cartel occurred, and also by the time of plea negotiations or sentencing, that it entitles them to at least an argument that they should get a deferred prosecution agreement. Usually from the second company on in from a cartel, they all have to plead guilty and pay a fine. Now it gives defense counsel the ability to argue for a DPA, a deferred prosecution agreement, plus a further reduction in any penalty. So it's a big deal in terms of the change. But I think there's another point not to be missed here, Tom, which is the details of the work that was done by the staff relating to compliance programs is something that everybody, I think, should look at, because it's not just their principles and objectives and strategies that cut across all compliance issues, not just keeping people out of cartels.
There was one thing that I really hoped you could explain a little bit, because as you know, I've always practiced on the civil side of things, and this evaluation of corporate compliance programs really revolves around criminal conduct. So I was wondering if you could explain how this document, or how an effective compliance program really works at the charging stage and at the sentencing stage.
So at the charging stage, where let's say you're the second or third company in, somebody else has reported before you, you will fully cooperate. Let's say you present and you provide information to them in the hopes of getting a sweetheart deal. And so usually what would happen is, I was just involved in a case where we were the first company in, and the second team in came in, or the second company came in, and they had to plead guilty, and they had to agree to pay a $28 million fine for cartel activity. And so if you're able to demonstrate that you had an effective ethics and compliance program in place, and no program is perfect, and that there were not any significant gaps in it, and that this occurred notwithstanding that, or maybe you detected the conduct itself because of your program, meaning an internal investigation of some sort, a report, a whistleblower type report or something, then you would go and you would argue to the prosecutors, look, we gave you a lot of information. We presented to you a lot of data and facts and material about our compliance program. We would like to get a deferred prosecution agreement where you file an information with the court and it's held for, let's say, 3 years, and we will agree to various remediation steps. There can even be a monitor, but unlikely to occur in these days. And plus, instead of paying a fine of whatever, let's say $50 million, we think we should get, we would argue that we should get a reduction down to $40 million. So that's done at the charging stage. At the sentencing phase, when the court, let's say you don't win the deferred prosecution agreement, you have to plead guilty. So the company pleads guilty, and then comes the sentence. And then there's a question as to whether or not your company is going to be put on probation. And this is a big deal because probation can always be revoked. If you're following an interesting case in this area is Carnival Cruise Line, not because of antitrust violations, but they've had their probation now revoked twice, where a federal judge also threatened to not let them use certain ports in the United States until they got their compliance program in conformance. So basically, when you're put on probation, you're under court supervision. You have a probation officer. There's reporting that's done. The probation officer does evaluations of your compliance program as well as other remedial steps. And if you fail in any way, then they can go to the judge and say, revoke the probation and impose an additional fine or penalize them in other ways. And so that's another way that you can stand up in front of the judge, and the government can say, as a result of their cooperation, their compliance program enhancements, we recommend against probation, a probationary sentence. And that can come into play at the sentencing phase. So those are the two real times and issues that come up.
Mike, there were 3 or 4 things that struck me as particularly applicable for the anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance practitioner and ABC programs that were listed in the antitrust compliance program that I'd like to throw out. The first was in the area of design and comprehensiveness, where the antitrust compliance program asks questions such as who is responsible for integrating antitrust policies and procedures into the company's business practice, and in what specific ways are antitrust compliance policies and procedures reinforced throughout the company's internal controls. And I really like those because they emphasize, number one, the business practice nature of compliance, and number two, the intertwining with internal controls. As I think it would be fair to say a large part of antitrust analysis, at least, is a numeric or monetary analysis. And so I think that the division has brought some of that gestalt to the ABC compliance program, particularly around the events that employees are attending, where competitors may be involved. I have worked overseas where if you were a U.S. expat, you worked for an energy company, and we all socialized together. We got together for barbecues. We got together at the swim club. We got together at wherever we may have congregated, and so that is one area I think of concern, but also just industry events. SECE is getting ready to fire off here in a couple of weeks, and the biggest industry event in compliance. And I think it would be an appropriate time for a company to look at additional training or more focused training, because you're certainly going to be around your competitors. And then that really leads to the risk assessment, because the risk assessment asks, is your antitrust compliance program tailored to your business lines, the industries you're in, and consistent with industry best practices? So it's not a middle-of-the-road program. It's not, do you have something in place? It's, is it consistent with industry best practices? And that's really by business line. And then finally, what information or metrics has the company collected to help detect antitrust violations? And I'm going to use that to talk about the Juniper Networks case that we're going to take up in our subsequent podcast. But for example, if the company bids on contracts, is the bid information subject to evaluation to detect possible bid rigging? Is the company evaluating pricing changes for price fixing? I think these are analysis that are not unusual for an antitrust compliance practitioner, but these would be for the ABC compliance practitioner, yet they could give greater insights into where the money might go. On training, has the company updated training based upon prior antitrust violations or even compliance incidents? Is it reflecting marketplace, legal, or technological changes? And then under review, monitoring, auditing, it asked, does the company use any type of screen, communications monitoring tool? And then finally, statistically designed testing to identify potential antitrust violations. And once again, Mike, I think that is not inconsistent with an antitrust compliance practice. It's probably was consistent with some of the things that you looked at back when you were with the division, low those many years ago. Nevertheless, those many years ago. Nevertheless, I think this is something that most ABC compliance practitioners are not fully utilizing. And as we see more sophisticated bribery schemes, as we see questions that the question that you continually ask, follow the money, I think we're going to see more of this type of statistical analysis to see if there is a big spike in sales, what are the implications from the anti-bribery, anti-corruption perspective in addition to the antitrust perspective.
Well, Tom, your outline is spot on. And I think what's interesting here is they adopted, or they sort of, you can see how they sort of took the criminal division draft and sort of wove into it all of certain antitrust concerns. But unbeknownst to some people, I think they pushed the envelope in some areas. And I think that's great. I think it gives the compliance practitioner more ammunition for imposing certain requirements. So one of the things you mentioned was attendance at industry meetings. Well, the guidance questions actually suggest that a company should be tracking all contacts with competitors, including the industry meetings, and wants to know how the company is monitoring such tracking data. Well, in the ABC area, people have done that with regard to gifts and entertainment, but in terms of interactions between, let's say, state-owned enterprise representatives and your business development people, I don't see that kind of tracking going on, but nor does the criminal division's guidance ever impose that specifically. But notice how the antitrust division used that concept of attendance at industry meetings to sort of broaden that concept, the idea of tracking that. The other point I was going to just pick up on what you said, which I think is really interesting, is the monitoring function of the business activities. So now, when you put in a tender offer, and to compliance should have a seat at the table in that process so that they can ensure there's been no sort of bid rigging or communications with competitors around that. And the statistical analysis is really cutting edge, because in the antitrust area, there is some sort of research that's been conducted. There are a couple of authors who have been suggesting that is there a way to detect cartel activity by examining what you were saying, volumes, pricing, what people are doing in the industry. So I think that was really cutting edge, and I think it's going to make people think about what monitoring and detecting resources and strategies they're using. One last point is one of the things that's really interesting for antitrust is when you examine a market or a business line, let's say, is to look at how many competitors you have, because the lower the numbers of competitors, the easier it is to arrange a cartel. And that's one of the markers that they use when looking at mergers, how many competitors will be left in the market. And then an important issue is the homogeneity of the product itself. In other words, if I sell batteries for flashlights and I raise my price, will people just go and use Tom Fox's batteries, which are the same and look the same? Mine are silver, yours are gold. That raises the risk of cartel activity, because as a way to eliminate competition, because our goods are so substitutable for each other, and if there's a small number of competitors, we have a greater incentive to engage in cartel activity. And that's what the risk assessment idea here is. Okay, we want you to look at those factors that they look at when looking at markets and figuring out whether they're competitive or not. So this document is really cutting edge, and I mean we're getting sort of the highlights, because there are a lot more areas here where they took what was from the criminal division and they really tailored it to their own interest. One other last issue, to me, a pet peeve, is they addressed the issue, and I'm glad they did. Was senior management involved in this in a cartel activity? Do they have and how committed are they, again, to compliance, and what role do they play, or what risks do they set up? And here we're seeing the beginning of examining your C-suite risks, and that's the Antitrust Division sort of planting some seeds, I think, here for some interesting issues as we go along.
So, Mike, I guess the thing that really struck me when I sat down and really took a deep dive into this was, once again, not being on the criminal side of things, not really ever having focused on antitrust practice as a litigator or a corporate lawyer, how much of this really was directly applicable to ABC compliance, and really, as you said, how much of it is cutting edge and things that the anti-corruption compliance practitioner, chief compliance officer, or compliance professional needs to think about incorporating into their own ABC compliance program.
And I think you raise a really good point, because I think people who are in compliance should read this whether or not they have significant antitrust risks, criminal cartel risks, because there's a lot here. There are a lot of good ideas, and I look for any good source of ideas, and I think if you want to distinguish your program, there are some ideas in here, I think, in, let's say, the ABC area, sanctions, anything, AML. There are ideas in here that you could clearly apply to those risks as well, particularly what you've mentioned with regard to ABC and sort of the business process type of risks, and ways to detect and monitor conduct through participation in the business process.
It looks like we're out of time for this episode, but it was great talking about Horsefeathers. We're going to talk about it some more, and I think the Antitrust Division's evaluation of corporate compliance programs is a really significant document going forward. So I look forward to seeing where it may go for us.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Why a Duck. Make sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed the episode, leave a review.